So I have turned down what must be getting towards 10 TV and radio opportunities this week. And I've done so because it's on a subject which I think is not best addressed through inflammatory, angry, like oppositional debating. And of course, I'm talking about trans rights. And I really think that this is a subject where the global fascist oligarchy, the international mainstream patriarchy, is just delighted to have found an angle where they can pitch the LGBT community against feminist groups who are, concerned about things like refuges and prisons, right? If they can get those two groups, they have absolutely no skin in either game, to fight against each other, they are just sitting back and skimming money out of our march towards nuclear environmental Armageddon, and we're all too distracted to challenge them on it. But I've just been asked too many times, and so I'm going to say something, and I appreciate that it's a controversial subject. So, please take my initial gambit of saying I don't think this should be a big angry argument. I think this should be a very polite and nuanced discussion, and listen to the end and respond with compassion, right? If you want to respond. First of all, the Supreme Court ruling is much smaller than it seems. It concerns the Equalities Act. Now, the Equalities Act, in terms of its main issues, hasn't been affected. The Equalities Act says you can't be discriminated against in public life, including, in public spaces and, of course, in the jobs market and all of that, on the basis of a series of protected characteristics. And that includes, race and religion and all that kind of stuff. And just to be super clear, sex is on there and gender recognition is also on there. And they are quite articulate that this includes the sex that doctors decided you were when you were born. It includes what your DNA says. It includes how you present in public and what assumptions people might make about you. It includes what you tell people about yourself and the way that they respond to that. Like every aspect of that, even if people just assume you're a woman from the back because you're wearing a pink shirt, if they're discriminating against you on the basis of that, even if you're like a cis dude, like you are still protected against that sort of discrimination. That has not been affected in any way. The issue is that the Equalities Act has this thing in it that allows exceptions in certain specific necessary circumstances, right? And the only example they give when it comes to sex is refuges for women who've been victims of male violence. And what this Supreme Court ruling has done is it has clarified, because it wasn't clear before, that now we already knew that if you're setting up something like a women's refuge, you can say, I don't want any men in here, and that is to keep those women safe. And it says you're allowed to break the Equalities Act, basically. You're allowed to break the Equalities Act in order to create an environment for a very specific situation, and it has to be proportionate, and it has to be something that people actually are saying they need and are saying they benefit from, and so on and so forth. It probably affects at most a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand specific roles around the UK, places like rape crisis centres and things like that. And it says you're allowed to make that exception. You don't have to. There are also, of course, domestic violence centres that are open to people of all sexes, and there are also domestic violence centres that employ people of all sexes. But if you choose to run one that is just for women, you are allowed to. And this ruling says within that, if you choose, because you deem it to be appropriate, because it seems proportionate, to make that cis only, then you can. Now, of course, you could also start one that was trans only or non-binary only. You could have a refuge that was just for men and only employed men, and you could make the decision about whether to include trans men in that or not. What they're saying is when you've made this special exception on grounds which you can see are appropriate and proportionate, that is one of the ways in which you are allowed to cut the pie if you want to. I'm not even going to get engaged in the discussion about whether that's the right decision, about who might be affected by it. For this reason, the biggest issue we have with provision of domestic violence shelters in the UK is not enough by a factor of like tenfold. the waiting time to get into a domestic violence shelter is 6 months, right? Basically at minimum. And nobody should be trying to run away from a violent and abusive household and having to wait 6 months, regardless of, you know, any characteristics they might have or any preferences they might have. Everybody should be able to get away to somewhere safe. And I think that really highlights why this issue is such a sort of problematic one to get involved in the argument about. So what I'm hearing all over social media is about toilets. Nothing in this ruling affects toilets. The Equalities Act doesn't really cover toilets. And we know that because how often do I go in the gents? All the time. When was the last time I went in the gents? Yesterday. There's a service station on the A1, and I saw, because the guy opened the thing, there's like 4 cubicles for men and the women's was one single cubicle, and there was somebody in it, there was somebody else waiting. Boom, I was in the gents. The Equalities Act doesn't cover toilets. Those are down to individual decisions, and of course people do make decisions about their own toilets and about the toilets in their business or whatever, and how they want to label them and what they want to say to people about using them. But that's got nothing to do with the Equalities Act. That's about people. And in fact, I think it's dangerous if people look at this Supreme Court ruling and then say, well, therefore I must make a ruling about the toilets in my cafe, because it's not telling you to do that, and it's not related to that. That's not covered. And I also think that if you've had a problem with toilets recently, 99.9% chance it's because there wasn't one when you needed one. And what we should do about the toilet situation is we should make it a requirement for councils to provide enough public toilets, because you shouldn't be hanging around pret-a-manger hoping that somebody gives you a code. You shouldn't be waiting around at a bus station unable to find a toilet because it's too late and McDonald's is closed and you can't get into somewhere. It shouldn't be like that. Providing toilets should be a public service, and if we did it publicly, Keir Starmer, close the tax havens, put in a wealth tax, there's plenty of money for this, we could of course provide lots of individual cubicles with baby change facilities, etc, etc, and people who didn't feel comfortable using the single sex toilets, well, they could go and use the individual cubicles. Ditto, lots on the ground floor, lots with bars for the use of disabled people, etc, etc. Prisons, not a real issue. Of course, people should not be in a prison cell with somebody who makes them feel unsafe. And the solution to that is to have well-funded prisons with enough space for anybody who wants to be in a cell on their own. Prisons should be supervised. People should go to prison and feel safe in prison. The fact that trans women are worried about being in a men's prison, and the fact that women in a women's prison might be concerned about somebody from a men's prison being transferred over suddenly, perhaps because it looks like it's a less authoritarian regime, or it looks like an easier place to be, or whatever the reasoning behind that might be. And of course their genuine identity and how they feel about themselves would be one of those reasons. If everybody should just be entitled to say, I'd like a cubicle, a cell on my own, and everybody should be entitled to feel safe. There should be enough wardens and all that kind of stuff. And our prison service is grossly underfunded, and lots of people are in prison who shouldn't be, including lots and lots of women. The number of women in prison for violent offences is something like 100 odd. And the number of children away from their mothers because their mothers are in prison is in the order of thousands. And that's not a society that benefits people. We should be looking at community-based punishments, rehabilitation, and supporting people so that they don't end up in that world. And we should also be looking at all the stupid crimes we've come up with, like irritating protests, etc, etc, and scrapping those from the record books. Sports, I guess that's the other one that comes up quite a lot, and the answer there is that 98% of sports funding goes to men's sports. And the idea that trans women and cis women are having to fight for the remaining 2%. It shouldn't be an issue. We should be getting 50% of the funding. And then we could go round, and individual sports, who have always had rules about what is and isn't allowed in terms of what drugs you're allowed to take, what drugs you're not allowed to take, in terms of what equipment you're allowed to use, what you're not allowed to use, what categories people are in for the Paralympics, all that kind of stuff. Individual sports could then make an assessment about who they're comfortable you know, analysing and figuring out what's a fair competition, because the whole point of sports is to try and make it fair and fun and encourage people to get involved. And they should simply be looking on a case-by-case basis at how they can best do that. And people could then, you know, in a civilised way, make their case to the authorities and have a conversation about it. And people who honestly have never shown any interest in sports until this issue came up should be able to quietly back down and step away from it. Now, finally, I think a part of the problem is this use of the term turf. Not because it's deeply offensive. I don't think that it's. I think if it's relevant, it's fine or whatever. The point is this: that as soon as you see somebody being transphobic, and of course there are horrendously transphobic people out there, they're referred to as a turf, which suggests that they're a radical feminist. But like, speaking on behalf of radical feminists, like, suddenly people are telling me Douglas Murray's on my side. People are telling me that all sorts of horrific right-wing crazy people are now radical feminists. It's simply not the case, right? I mean, I've said this jokingly before, but nobody told me J.K. Rowling was a feminist until she started saying controversial things about trans rights. If she was a radical feminist, the books would be called Hermione Granger and the Philosopher's Stone, right? And she's welcome to be a public figure with opinions, and you're welcome to agree with her or disagree with her. I do think that women and people of colour who express these opinions get, responded to more harshly than the overwhelming majority of cis white guys who are saying things that actually I'm extremely uncomfortable with. But nonetheless, what has happened is that by making this a divisive issue, then right-wing extremists have piled on, fanned the flames, funded both sides, stirred it up, and I don't think that we come out of it with an argument that is worth having. I think that actually we, all of us, are on the same side, the side of we need to smash that patriarchy and sort out this planet in an absolutely radical, and we do need radical feminism and radical LGBT rights campaigning. And guess what? They're the same thing. I now step back and watch what will happen in the comments, but I hope that you appreciate that this is something I wanted to say from a place of compassion, and I'm saying this instead of taking probably a grand's worth of TV work, because I don't want to be shouting this at Piers Morgan. See you next week, if you're still here. Increasingly, the mainstream media is terrible at informing the public of what is really going on. I'm only able to make these videos because people are generous enough to sponsor me making them, and if you're able to be a part of that, I would hugely appreciate it. It can cost as little as $1 a month, and you'll get loads of fun bonus content and lots of extras from me and my undying gratitude. I also massively appreciate it if you're able to like, share these videos and let people out there know what's going on.